The Tulsi Gabbard and Schiff confrontation was never just one more Democratic family quarrel. It became important because it touched one of the most fragile nerves in American politics. What happens when a person who once belonged to one coalition defects not simply in preference but in worldview? And one of the coalition's most institutionally recognizable figures tries to stop the defection from being normalized into power? That is what made the pair matter. Tulsi Gabbard was not only a former Democratic congresswoman who became one of Donald Trump's most provocative national security nominees, she was a symbol of ideological migration. A person who once sounded like a maverick critic inside the party became, in the eyes of many Democrats, an anti-establishment weapon increasingly aligned with the rights war against the intelligence, foreign policy, and security class. Schiff, meanwhile, was one of the most identified Democratic guardians of that class, or at least of its public legitimacy in the Trump era. He had long been associated with the Russia investigations, impeachment, intelligence oversight, and the belief that democratic institutions had been under sustained assault by Trump and his allies. That is why when Schiff turned against Gabbard's rise, and when Gabbard's nomination became a real fight rather than a hypothetical scandal, the confrontation carried far more weight than a normal nomination dispute. It was not only senator versus nominee, it was defector versus gatekeeper. Gabbard represented the argument that the old foreign policy and intelligence consensus had failed badly enough that a disruptive, anti-establishment critic deserved a shot at commanding part of the national security state. Schiff represented the argument that national security institutions may be imperfect, but placing a figure with Gabbard's record, judgment, and sympathies in charge of intelligence would not be reform. It would be recklessness. That is the core conflict, and it is why the pair belongs in a long-form script, because the fight between them reveals a deeper problem than one confirmation battle. When large parts of the public lose trust in the custodians of national security, how does a democracy distinguish between overdue dissent and dangerous erosion of the standards needed to protect secret institutions from politicized capture? Schiff's answer is procedural, evidentiary, and rooted in judgment. Look at the record. Look at the statements. Look at the Russia echoes. Look at the Snowden defense. Look at the Syria posture. Look at the 2017 trip to meet Bashar al-Assad. Look at the gaps in intelligence experience. Do not confuse anti-establishment branding with qualification to supervise all 18 U.S. intelligence agencies. Gabbard's symbolic answer is the opposite. Look at the failures of the people now warning about me. Look at the wars. Look at the groupthink. Look at the selective outrage. Look at how the same institutions that claim to protect democracy also help generate deep public distrust through secrecy, overreach, and a refusal to admit error. Do not confuse establishment alarm with objective wisdom. These are not trivial positions. That is why the confrontation mattered. And it mattered more in early 2025 because Gabbard's nomination became real enough to force everyone to stop talking in theory. Senators were pressing Gabbard over comments seen as echoing Russia's justification for war, her criticism of U.S. policy in Syria, and her 2017 meeting with Assad, alongside broader concerns about her lack of deep intelligence experience. Those facts matter because they show the confrontation was not symbolic only. It had institutional stakes. Gabbard was not just offending an old rival. She was on the verge of taking command of one of the most sensitive coordinating roles in the national security state. That is why Schiff's opposition became so vivid. In February 2025, Schiff publicly warned from the Senate floor that Gabbard had shown alarming judgment, ties to dictators, and unfitness for the role. This is where the pairing becomes especially sharp, because Schiff was not speaking as a random partisan attacker. He was speaking as someone whose own political identity had been built around intelligence oversight and the defense of institutional seriousness in the face of Trump's attacks. Gabbard's rise was therefore almost tailor-made to provoke him. She challenged not merely a nomination norm, but an entire structure of legitimacy he had spent years defending. He believed, in effect, that the intelligence world could not be reformed by placing someone hostile or cavalier toward core democratic threat perceptions at its center. Her coalition believed, in effect, that the intelligence world would never meaningfully reform if its own gatekeepers always reserve the right to declare disruptive critics unfit. That is the fight, and it sits inside a larger democratic civil war over the meaning of dissent. Tulsi Gabbard did not begin as a right-wing figure. She began as an insurgent Democrat, someone critical of interventionism, skeptical of establishment foreign policy, willing to attack Barack Obama's Syria approach, Hillary Clinton's orbit, and much of what the post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan security consensus had hardened into. That gave her an early kind of authenticity, but over time that authenticity migrated. And to supporters, it remained proof of independence. To critics, it curdled into something else, a willingness to drift wherever anti-establishment attention was strongest, even if that meant validating or echoing narratives useful to Trump, Russia, or other adversarial actors. Schiff stands on the other side of that divide because he represents the proposition that some forms of dissent stop being healthy skepticism and start becoming a genuine liability to democratic defense. That is why the Gabbard-Schiff story is not just ideological. It is epistemic. It is about when skepticism is wise and when skepticism becomes a solvent so strong that it eats the institution's capacity to tell friend from threat. Gabbard supporters often hear Schiff and think, of course he would say that. He is the embodiment of the national security and intelligence-inflected Democratic class that spent years policing acceptable narratives about Russia, Syria, and Trump. Schiff's supporters hear Gabbard and think, of course she says that. She is the perfect anti-establishment vessel for a movement that wants to corrode trust in precisely the institutions that must remain credible if the country is going to recognize foreign influence, internal extremism, and strategic deception in time. This is why the confrontation is so difficult to resolve. Each side sees the other's strongest quality as its most dangerous flaw. Schiff's seriousness looks to his side like responsibility. To hers, it looks like gatekeeping. Gabbard's skepticism looks to her side like courage. To his, it looks like impaired judgment. And that is the whole script in miniature. Now, from a narrative standpoint, what makes the pairing especially good is that it has both current stakes and a backstory of accumulated suspicion. Schiff was already one of the most loathed Democratic figures in Trump world because of Russia and impeachment. Gabbard had already become one of the most controversial apostates from the Democratic coalition because of foreign policy, Assad, and her increasingly overt realignment. So when their paths converged over the DNI nomination, it did not feel like a fresh quarrel. It felt like the formalization of an old distrust. That matters because old distrust gives new events more voltage. Schiff was not only saying this nominee worries me, he was in effect. He's saying this is exactly the kind of person a movement like Trump's would want running intelligence, and that itself should alarm you. Gabbard's coalition was not only saying she deserves a fair hearing, it was, in effect, saying the same people who spent years misjudging foreign policy and weaponizing moral certainty now want to tell us what counts as dangerous judgment. Why should we trust them? That is the deeper confrontation. One side defending expertise even after failure. The other side weaponizing failure into a case against the authority to define expertise at all. This is why the Reuters line about former national security officials criticizing Gabbard's nomination matters too. It showed that a lead alarm around her was not confined to Schiff. There was a wider community of professional dissent against the nomination. But in a strange way, that broader concern can help Gabbard politically as much as it hurts her. The more establishment alarm accumulates, the more she can be narrated by supporters as proof that the old order fears disruption more than danger. That is the paradox of anti-establishment nominations. Warnings can validate the warning, or they can validate the nominee. The audience chooses based on who they trust more. Schiff knows that. That is why his attacks on Gabbard had to sound substantive rather than tribal. He could not merely call her awful. He had to sound like someone discharging an institutional obligation. That is why the language of judgment is so central in his criticism. Judgment is the bridge word between ideology and fitness. He does not have to say every heterodox view disqualifies a nominee. He only has to show that taken together, her record reveals a pattern of judgment inconsistent with the responsibilities of the office. That is a smart move. But again, the environment is hostile to that kind of smart move. because judgment can easily be retranslated by her camp into conformity with the worldview of the security establishment. Once that translation occurs, the whole hearing becomes a class war in miniature. Establishment custodians of intelligence versus the public anger that wants to demote their custodianship. This is the longer political arc the pair makes visible. Can America still appoint anti-establishment figures to high national security office without eroding the very legitimacy intelligence work depends on? Or has the national security class become so distrusted that opposition from figures like Schiff automatically strengthens a nominee like Gabbard among precisely the people most eager to see that class cut down? The Gabbard-Schiff confrontation does not resolve that question. It dramatizes it, and that is why it matters. Because the United States increasingly lives in a condition where institutional credibility is contested not just by people outside power, but by people on the verge of inheriting power. Gabbard is not a fringe dissident anymore in this story. She is a nominee. That means anti-establishment critique is no longer only external pressure, it is trying to move into command. Schiff is resisting that move not as a pundit, but as an elected official convinced that some transfers of anti-establishment energy into secret state authority are simply too risky. That is a serious constitutional fight, not a petty feud. And it remains unresolved even if the vote is over, because the meaning of the vote continues. If Gabbard thrives in office, her supporters will read Schiff's warnings as proof that establishment panic was once again wrong. If she stumbles, Schiff's side will say the warning was clear all along. Either way, the confrontation keeps projecting itself forward. This is one reason the pair fits so well in the style you want. It has tension, moral stakes, identity conflict, hidden system implications, and a larger lesson about the republic itself. The larger lesson is this. Democracies become unstable when the people defending institutional trust and the people channeling anti-institutional distrust each believe the other side's very way of speaking is a danger to the country. Schiff believes people like Gabbard can normalize a style of skepticism that leaves intelligence work dangerously exposed to politicized capture and foreign-friendly ambiguity. Gabbard's rise tells the public that people like Schiff have been claiming exclusive authority over responsible judgment for too long, and that their own failures should disqualify them from deciding who counts as safe. That is why their confrontation matters. Not because one hates the other, not because the confirmation fight produced some singular perfect clip, but because it forced the country to ask whether it still wants the national security state guarded by the people who spent years defending it, or whether distrust has become so strong that many Americans would rather hand some of that authority to the people who built careers attacking the old guardians from within and without. That is the real Tulsi Gabbard versus Adam Schiff story. It is a struggle over who gets to decide what judgment means when the institution itself no longer has unquestioned authority to define it. And that is why the fight still echoes. Because the question it raises is bigger than either person. If the gatekeepers are distrusted, who gates the gatekeepers? Schiff answers one way, Gabbard's rise answers another, and the Republic is still choosing between them. There is another reason the Gabbard-Schiff pairing belongs in a long script. It stages one of the deepest unresolved conflicts inside modern American liberalism and its aftermath. The conflict is not simply hawk versus dove, establishment versus outsider, or intelligence class versus skeptic. It is the more painful question of what happens when anti-establishment critique stops being a pressure on institutions and starts becoming a pathway into controlling those institutions from above. Many democracies can absorb criticism from the margins. They struggle much more when the critic moves to the gate. That is what made Gabbard's path so volatile. As long as she was merely criticizing the foreign policy class, the national security class, or democratic orthodoxies from outside, the system could treat her as a factional annoyance, a maverick or an apostate. But once she became a serious nominee for Director of National Intelligence, her critique changed category. It was no longer just dissent. It was a bid to administer the very realm she had spent years telling the public not to trust. That is where Schiff's alarm became especially intelligible. He was not merely saying, "I dislike her worldview." He was saying, the worldview itself becomes a different thing when attached to secret state authority. That distinction matters because a lot of political movements love criticism more than they love administration. Criticism is clean. It can stay morally vivid. It can keep its outsider aura. Administration forces answers about what happens when the critic must now manage ambiguity, bureaucracy, classification, threat perception, or an institutional trust rather than simply exposing them. Schiff's essential argument about Gabbard's judgment was rooted in this transition. He feared not just her past comments, but what those comments implied about how she would interpret intelligence, adversaries, and the boundaries of democratic self-protection once she occupied real command. Gabbard's supporters, however, saw the same transition differently. To them, it was precisely the point that someone who distrusted the old class might now occupy its heights. If criticism never reaches command, then the establishment remains self-healing. It absorbs the complaint, survives the outrage, and continues reproducing itself. Gabbard's nomination therefore symbolized something thrilling to her coalition: the possibility that anti-establishment distrust could stop being commentary and become personnel. Schiff had to stop that not just because of her, but because of what her success would say about the right of the old guardians to keep defining who counts as responsible. This is why the confrontation is more revealing than a typical confirmation scuffle. It is not just about records and qualifications. It is about whether fitness is still a trustworthy category when the people most fluent in calling someone fit or unfit belong to institutions that millions blame for war, overreach, secrecy, and failed elite consensus. Schiff speaks the language of fitness. Gabbard's rise makes the public ask, who certifies the certifiers? That is a devastating democratic question, and it is one reason the hearing and floor fight around her nomination had such symbolic force. Schiff's warnings about her judgment, her ties, her statements, and her unsuitability sound entirely rational if you believe the intelligence system still requires custodians who broadly share certain baseline commitments about allies, adversaries, factual rigor, and institutional neutrality. But if you believe that same system has repeatedly used those commitments as cover for ideological groupthink and bureaucratic self-protection, then Schiff's warnings can sound less like prudence and more like the last defensive gesture of a failing order. Gabbard thrives in that translation gap. It is where her whole political identity became strongest. She is most potent not when she wins universal trust, but when she convinces enough people that elite distrust of her is itself evidence that she is hitting the right nerve. That means opposition from someone like Adam Schiff is never straightforwardly damaging. It can be, but it can also validate the anti-establishment reading. The more Schiff speaks as guardian, the more her supporters can say, exactly, that is why she matters. This is a problem for institutional defenders generally. Once their legitimacy is weakened, even well-grounded alarms risk becoming self-defeating. The alarm becomes part of the proof. Schiff faces that trap in this confrontation. He cannot stay silent because silence would abandon the substantive case. But by speaking loudly, he risks reinforcing the narrative that a distrusted national security establishment is circling the wagons against one of its enemies. That is another reason the pair is so narratively rich. It is built on symmetry of suspicion. Schiff suspects Gabbard's judgment precisely because she seems too willing to erode or relativize truths the intelligence world must take seriously. Gabbard's movement suspects Schiff precisely because he seems too willing to protect the old class's authority to define those truths. One fears corrosion from skepticism, the other fears domination through expertise. Both are reacting to real historical conditions. That is what gives a story depth. And those historical conditions matter. Post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan, post-Syria, post-Russia Gate, post-impeachment America is not a country that hears intelligence community consensus the way it once might have. There is too much residue, too much doubt, and too much sense that experts asked for trust and did not always earn it. Gabbard's political meaning is inseparable from that residue. She is not an accident. She is a product of accumulated failure and accumulated distrust. Schiff, similarly, is a product of the opposite impulse. The belief that even flawed institutions must still be defended against forces that would hollow them out entirely. That makes them more than adversaries. They are repositories of rival lessons from the same era. Gabbard's lesson is that elites who failed too often no longer deserve monopoly control over national security credibility. Schiff's lesson is that weakening elite control without reliable replacement risks turning national security into a playground for vanity, ideology, and strategic confusion. Both lessons are real. When that is why the country remains split, this is also where the symbolism of party defection matters so much. If Gabbard had always been a Republican outsider, Schiff's opposition would sound more routine. But because she once moved inside the Democratic coalition, because she once ran for president as a Democrat, because she once critiqued interventionism from a position many liberals initially found intriguing, her later move toward Trump world security power feels to former allies like a betrayal with teeth. Not a mere change of mind, but a repurposing of anti-war and anti-establishment language into service of a coalition they believe is far more dangerous than the old establishment she criticized. Schiff is one of the clearest public carriers of that sense of betrayal. And Gabbard, for her part, he likely views figures like Schiff as proof that anti-establishment criticism inside the old coalition was never going to be fully tolerated if it threatened the wrong set of assumptions. That is why the conflict often feels personal, even when it is substantive. Each reads the other not just as mistaken, but as confirmation that their deepest diagnosis of the system was right. That is a very durable kind of rivalry. It means every new event slots into an already existing narrative frame. A confirmation hearing is not just a hearing. It is either the overdue scrutiny of a reckless nominee or the establishment's attempted veto of a dissident entering real power. A Senate floor speech is not just a speech. It is either a warning from someone who understands the stakes or panic from someone losing control of the gate. The confrontation can therefore absorb endless new episodes without losing coherence. That is exactly what you want for this type of long-form channel writing. The pair gives you a spine strong enough to carry current events and backstory together. It lets you explain why the nomination was controversial, but also why it had to be controversial in a deeper sense. It is not just about Tulsi. It is about whether dissent from the security consensus can be trusted more once it is given a badge, a title, and access to the most secret layers of the state. Schiff says the answer is no, not without judgment that he believes she has failed to show. Gabbard's coalition says the answer is yes, precisely because the old consensus can no longer be trusted to supervise itself. That is the democratic wound this pair opens. Can a republic repair distrust in its hidden institutions by letting critics into command? Or does that simply make the institutions less stable without making them more trustworthy? Schiff fears the latter. Gabbard's rise bets on the former. That bet is what makes the confrontation so important. It is not academic. It goes to the heart of whether anti-establishment politics can become governance without losing the very emotional energy that made it attractive. Once inside the system, the critic must either govern with some continuity or govern as if disruption itself were still the point. Both paths are risky. Schiff's warnings are about those risks. Gabbard's support comes from a public segment willing to risk them anyway, because the old guardians exhausted too much trust to go unchallenged. That is why their fight matters now and later. It is a preview of what happens whenever weakened institutions are asked to judge the legitimacy of the people most eager to replace their moral authority. Schiff still believes the institution must judge. Gabbard's movement believes the judgment itself is part of the problem. And because the country has not resolved that disagreement, neither has their confrontation. There is another reason the Gabbard-Schiff pairing deserves to be fully expanded. It shows how the politics of national security have become inseparable from the politics of betrayal. Not treason in the legal sense, betrayal in the emotional sense. For Schiff and those who see the intelligence community as flawed but indispensable, Gabbard often appears as someone who kept moving closer to positions, gestures, and rhetorical habits that made the country less able to distinguish skepticism from strategic confusion. Her meeting with Assad, her handling of Snowden, her rhetoric around Russia and Ukraine, these are not, in that worldview, isolated disagreements. They form a cumulative pattern that says something is off in the calibration. The concern is not that every heterodox view is disqualifying. The concern is that the pattern of heterodoxy keeps landing in ways that favor adversarial narratives or weaken democratic confidence in the country's own capacity to interpret threats accurately. For Gabbard's supporters, the emotional betrayal runs the other way. They believe the old national security class betrayed the public first, through war, failed intervention, selective outrage, secretive power, ideological policing, and the expectation that ordinary people should keep trusting a priesthood that rarely pays a price for being wrong. In that reading, Gabbard is not the betrayer. She is the one who finally betrayed the priesthood itself. And because priesthoods hate apostates more than outsiders, the intensity of the backlash against her becomes, for supporters, part of the proof. That is what makes the Schiff element so valuable to the story. Schiff does not sound like a random partisan critic. He sounds like the high priest of a certain kind of post-Trump institutional seriousness. He carries the authority of process, oversight, hearings, intelligence warnings, and moral alarm about democratic vulnerability. When someone like that says Gabbard is unfit, the statement lands on two frequencies at once. For one audience, it lands as one of the strongest possible red flags. For the other, it lands as exactly what you would expect the priesthood to say when one of its apostates gets close to the sanctuary. That split is the real confrontation. And because it is so profound, it produces a strange political symmetry. Schiff thinks he is defending the Republic from corrosive misjudgment. Gabbard's coalition thinks it is defending the Republic from an entrenched class that long ago confused its own worldview with patriotism. Each side believes the other is not merely wrong, but dangerously overconfident in its right to define danger. This means the fight is not actually about one nominee's resume. It is about whether the country still accepts a common answer to the question, who has the authority to say what responsible national security judgment looks like? Schiff says the answer still must come substantially from experienced institutional stewards, even if they must be criticized and reformed. Gabbard's political rise says large numbers of people no longer accept that premise, and in fact may prefer someone precisely because the old stewards are scared of her. That is a staggering democratic development. It means distrust has advanced from mood to staffing. It is no longer enough to criticize institutions from outside. The public now wants proof that critics can enter and rearrange the institution itself. Gabbard's nomination represented that possibility. Schiff's resistance represented the effort to say that some institutions, especially intelligence institutions, cannot survive if rearrangement is driven chiefly by anti-establishment symbolic appetite. And this is why the pair has so much weight for long-form commentary. It dramatizes the country's difficulty in separating reform from capture. From one angle, Gabbard looks like overdue correction against a stale and self-protective class. From another, she looks like an invitation to politicize intelligence through precisely the sort of distrust that makes professional analysis harder. Schiff embodies the professional class response to that danger. But because the professional class is itself distrusted, his warning can validate the candidate as much as discredit her. That is the democratic paradox. The stronger the gatekeeper's alarm, the more some citizens suspect the gatekeeper is defending class territory. The stronger the outsider's appeal, the more other citizens fear the gate is about to be opened to something reckless. And neither fear is baseless. That is why the confrontation is so durable. And it gets even more durable when you consider the larger Trump world context. Gabbard's nomination did not occur in a vacuum. It came inside a broader political moment in which Trump was trying to place controversial, loyalty-tested, anti-establishment coded figures into major institutional roles quickly and forcefully. In that broader context, Schiff's opposition to Gabbard read not merely as policy dissent, but as a last defensive line around one of the most sensitive institutional domains. To Gabbard supporters, that broader context worked in the opposite direction. Finally, the old class is losing its veto. That is what makes the pairing structurally dramatic. Like it is one of the clearest places where the national security state itself becomes the terrain of a populist legitimacy struggle rather than merely its observer. Gabbard is not just attacking from outside. She is standing at the door. Schiff is not just arguing abstractly. He is trying to keep the public from treating anti-establishment energy as a sufficient credential for secret state power. This is where the viewer begins to see the larger constitutional issue. Democracies need intelligence institutions, but intelligence institutions cannot be democracies in the ordinary sense. They depend on hierarchy, secrecy, classification, and professional interpretation. That makes them especially vulnerable to public distrust because the public cannot fully see or evaluate the work itself. If trust collapses, which the temptation grows to install symbolic correctives rather than purely technocratic choices, Gabbard is one such symbolic corrective. Schiff is warning that symbolic correction is not the same as operational prudence. This is a sophisticated conflict. It deserves length because it reveals that many American nomination battles are no longer really about qualifications in a narrow sense. They are rituals through which the country decides whether establishment credibility or anti-establishment authenticity feels more legitimate in a given domain. In most domains, that matters. In intelligence, it matters even more, because the public must trust judgments it often cannot independently verify. That is why Schiff's phraseology around judgment is so important. He is fighting for the principle that, somewhere, somebody must still be able to say, this pattern of statements, relationships, and instincts points to an unacceptable risk. If that principle fully collapses, then every nomination becomes just another tribal alignment fight. Gabbard's coalition, however, hears the same principle as the old class once again asserting a monopoly over who gets to be called safe. It is not rejecting all standards, it is rejecting their custodians. And that is what makes the clash impossible to cleanly resolve. Both sides are making a claim about legitimacy that rests on prior distrust of the other's source of legitimacy. Schiff trusts institutional experience more than insurgent symbolism. Gabbard's movement trusts insurgent symbolism more than institutional experience. The public has no neutral judge above them, and not because the judge is exactly what the confrontation is about. That is why the pairing remains compelling long after the vote count. It keeps asking, can a democracy repair broken trust in hidden institutions by letting their critics govern them? Or do some institutions become less reliable, not more, when that distrust becomes their organizing principle? Schiff fears the second answer. Gabbard's rise is built on the hope of the first. The country is still sorting out which fear will dominate,